It was a quiet afternoon when Ethan Carter, a man who had seen his fair share of conflict, spotted Margaret Maggie Whitman marching toward his yard. He knew her well, the self-appointed queen of the neighborhood, always wielding her clipboard like a weapon. He had ignored her antics before, but today felt different. "Ethan," she called out, her voice dripping with that familiar smugness. Setting his iced tea down, Ethan stood. "What can I do for you, Maggie?" She didn't hesitate. "You're in violation of the HOA code, and I'm here to issue a fine." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Violation of what exactly?" Maggie smirked, waving her clipboard. "Your house doesn't meet the aesthetic standards of the community, and if you don't comply, I'll escalate this." Ethan chuckled. "Aesthetic standards? You mean my yard?" "You're disturbing the harmony of the neighborhood," she pressed, stepping closer. "And if you don't fix it, I'll ensure you regret it." That was when Ethan knew this wasn't just about a minor infraction. This was a power play. Maggie thrived on control, and she had convinced herself she had the final say in everything. But she had no idea who she was dealing with. "You really think you have that kind of authority?" Ethan asked, his tone shifting. Maggie's eyes gleamed. "I know I do." Ethan pulled out his phone and dialed. Maggie's smirk wavered as he spoke calmly into the receiver. "What are you doing?" she demanded. Ethan locked eyes with her. "Making sure this stops permanently." Minutes later, an official HOA representative arrived, flanked by a legal advisor. Maggie paled. "Mrs. Whitman," the representative said, "we've received multiple complaints about your conduct. We're here to inform you that you are being removed from your position, effective immediately." Maggie's face went from smug to horrified. "You can't do this." Ethan crossed his arms. "I didn't have to. You did it to yourself." For the first time, Maggie was powerless, and Ethan Carter had made sure she would never abuse her authority again. Maggie stood frozen, her grip tightening on the clipboard as if it could save her. The HOA representative's words rang in her ears. She had been stripped of her so-called power. This is a mistake," she stammered. "I was only trying to keep order." Ethan Carter shook his head, stepping closer. "Order? Maggie, you've spent months harassing people, threatening them over nonsense. You never had real authority, just fear. And now? That's gone." Maggie's eyes darted around, looking for someone, anyone, to back her up. But the neighborhood had turned against her. A few residents had gathered at the edges of their lawns, whispering, watching her unravel. The HOA legal advisor cleared his throat. "Mrs. Whitman, we've also been made aware of past complaints regarding your conduct. Given the circumstances, the board has decided to review whether you should even remain in this neighborhood." Ethan folded his arms. "Actions have consequences, Maggie." For the first time, Maggie looked small. The bravado was gone, replaced by desperation. "You can't just—" "I can," Ethan interrupted. "And I did." She opened her mouth to protest, but nothing came out. Slowly she turned, walking back toward her house, the clipboard dangling at her side like a broken shield. Ethan exhaled, watching her retreat. The neighborhood, once under her oppressive rule, was finally free. As he turned back to his porch, he knew one thing for certain. Maggie Whitman had finally learned that real power wasn't about control. It was about respect. And she had lost both. Would you like to expand on this further or add another layer of drama? Days passed, but the fallout from Margaret Whitman's downfall had only just begun. News of her removal from the HOA spread like wildfire, and with it came more revelations. Neighbors who had once stayed silent finally spoke up. Stories of Maggie's intimidation tactics surfaced, fines she had fabricated, threats she had made, and the countless people she had bullied into submission. What once seemed like a petty neighborhood dispute had now turned into something much bigger. Ethan Carter made sure of that. He compiled testimonies, forwarded them to the HOA board, and even reached out to local officials. It wasn't about revenge. It was about justice. Maggie had used her influence to manipulate and control, and Ethan wasn't going to let her escape the consequences. The final blow came when the HOA board made their decision. Not only was she permanently banned from holding any position of authority, but she was also given a formal citation for harassment. Worse still, the Homeowners Association issued an ultimatum. Either she corrected her behavior, or they would pursue legal action. Humiliated, isolated, and stripped of the power she had wielded so ruthlessly, Maggie had no choice but to leave. A moving truck arrived just a few weeks later. She barely made eye contact with anyone as she loaded the last of her belongings, her presence fading from the neighborhood like a bad memory. Ethan stood on his porch, watching in silence as she drove away. For the first time in years, the neighborhood felt lighter, like a storm had finally passed. And as Ethan sat back with his iced tea, he smiled. Maggie had tried to rule with fear, but in the end, it was respect and justice that won. Would you like to add any final twists or further consequences for Maggie?